The boy had become a master of his game. He had found all the secret ways out of the city and learned how to avoid the soldiers which seemed to guard every street. Whether Russian or American, the boy had learned which units were lax in their posts and which remained vigilant. The boy had by nature and necessity become a thief. The city was a ruin of bombed buildings, and even more so ruined people. His mother was continuously ill from the wretched conditions and constant back-breaking labor of her daily life. And yet her devotion to her child pushed her ever onward. He had become desperate and begged the occupying soldiers to have mercy on his mother and aunt. But mercy was a dream left over from a not-too-distant past. His aunt was younger and still pretty. She had taken to prostituting herself to the soldiers for bread and clean water. But his mother had not been so fortunate. He found it bitterly amusing that he should think of being a whore as good fortune. His aunt had on more than one occasion been attacked, and had taken one of the diseases which such activities could inflict. He had watched the transition of these two women from strong, loving mothers and wives into broken and degraded shells of their former selves, with helplessness and horror. The real tragedy to him seemed that they were blameless of the crimes of which they were being punished. They were not Nazis, and no member of his family had supported the madman who had butchered Germany. But to the eyes of the Allied soldiers, they were all the same. They were all German. He had taken to wandering the streets at night, sifting through the rubble for anything of value, and then one night came across a drain pipe which led into utter cold, wet blackness. It would be another week before he had dared brave that darkness with only a hand lantern to light his way. What he had found at the end was a portal into freedom, or at least some measure of the forgotten emotion. There were camps of soldiers everywhere outside the city, but he was a shadow walking in the night. If he had been caught, then his fate would have been horrible to contemplate. There were those soldiers who did not differentiate between the flesh of women and those of young boys. But Emmers, as his mother called him, was as clever and quiet as the shadows in which he traveled. The second time that he had crossed through the occupying camps, he had made it into the countryside, and there he had felt exhilaration like none he could have imagined during the years before the fall of Berlin. He had headed back in the direction of his hometown, and after many hours amongst the trees and fields near his old home, he had lingered too long and been caught by the rising rays of the sun. Exhausted and hungry, he had hidden in an abandoned home and slept on a soft feather mattress for the first time in months. After awakening, he had begun searching through the dusty drawers and closets for items of value, and had found many left by the uprooted family. He had taken the necklace and jar of coins with shame, but upon returning through the drainpipe tunnel the next night, had felt only triumph. He had presented his acquisitions with silent modesty to his mother and aunt, who had looked at first fretful, but soon melted into tears of joy. Thus had begun his profession and his game. Soon his outings would last for days, while he scoured over isolated farms and homes where the soldiers had not taken all things of value. He would learn that many German people had so feared capture by the Russians in particular that entire families had killed themselves rather than suffer the torture and rape of their loved ones. Emmers would find houses where corpses lay quietly on the floor of their kitchens and dining rooms, rotting in the summer heat. It was in these temples of quiet self-destruction where he found the most interesting and valuable treasures, items which could be traded in the city for food and safety. It had been one beautiful morning when the birds sang blissfully and the green trees swayed in a cool breeze that he had found what had been a particularly large and productive vineyard. He had walked along, snatching grapes and chewing them happily when he spotted the massive barn which rose dark and foreboding over the vast overgrown field. Checking his large canvas bag and finding it still light, he walked towards the structure, content in the isolation of the area. It was there that he was confronted with another of his secrets. As a tiny child, he had complained to his mother and father of the ghosts which he saw passing through the hallways of the house at night. They had first appeared after he had suffered a long fever when he was only 4 years old. Often he did recognize them, but when his grandmother had begun appearing in the kitchen in the dark morning hours, he had cried in sorrow, as he had been told she was in heaven. His mother had explained that these things were only products of his imagination and the frightening tales that other children had told him. She disregarded his pleas that the other children had told him no such stories, and that the shades were in fact very real. After his fits continued, he had finally been taken to the priest, who had made him feel very foolish and sinful for his fantasies. After several nights deprived of his supper, he had learned to never speak again of the pale figures he saw wandering in the yard at night, and even more so, he had learned to never acknowledge the ghosts should they become confused, angry, or even worse, demanding of his service to their longings and sorrows. Now, in the days while he wandered the countryside, he saw these spirits in a horrible and frightening excess. Here at this barn, there were many gathered outside in a group, staring at the door with wonder and terror as the light of the morning sun passed through their vague and translucent forms. He approached and ignored them as best he could, but still one, the patriarch of the group, a middle-aged, bearded specter with a large brimmed hat, looked down and spoke. "Do not go in there, boy," the spirit said, as if it realized he could see it. As was his practice, he did not react to the spirit's words and continued forward. The massive tall doors were ajar as he pushed them wider and crept in. The air was thick and musty, with the smell of decay and rot. He looked up and saw a now familiar sight. The forms of an entire family hanging limp and black with flies from the rafters of the barn's roof. He walked in carefully and imagined a day when the father had taken all his sons and daughters to this hollow red building and tied ropes around their necks and instructed them to stand on barrels. Now they hung as grisly and long-dead ornaments over the floor strewn with straw and dirt. There were stalls along the side where animals had lain in starvation. Emmers remembered that in these parts guns and ammunition were a rarity. The residents had been forced to devise other methods of ending their lives before the occupation was underway. Emmers was preparing to leave when he heard a sound coming from one of the stalls where a cow or horse may have been housed. He stopped as he heard the shuffling and looked into the shadows beyond the rays of light shining through the loft. He wondered if a fox or other such creature had wandered in to make a feast of the rotted flesh, and heard the sound again. Determined to disregard the noise and be on his way, he made to leave, and then he heard a voice. "Hello there, child." The voice echoed through the emptiness of the vast musty barn. He did not respond for fear that it was some refugee, or perhaps another ghost. "I know that you can hear me, boy. I can feel you staring over here. You may respond. I mean you no harm." Despite his misgivings, Emmers stepped forward. "Hello. Who are you?" "A scavenger, like yourself. There are many things of value to be found amongst the dead, wouldn't you agree?" Emmers did not answer, but nodded. "Don't be bashful, boy. I am not one of the pitiful wretches stunting outside." "Are you what they are afraid of?" he asked, with his curiosity growing as the strange shuffling continued behind the closed stall door. He saw the latch jiggle as the other brushed the gate. "Indeed I am." But you shouldn't be afraid. I've been watching you. Emmers immediately felt a twinge of fear as he thought of fleeing, but something about the calm, congenial tone of the speaker held him still. "How could you be watching me?" he asked, his voice cracking slightly. "I see many things, but you are something truly special. I could help you. I could teach you things that no one else can." "What kind of things?" he asked, as his hands broke into a cold, panicked sweat. "Just watch." And before Emmer's eyes, he watched with terrified fascination as the rotted corpses dangling above began to move in jerks and spasms before beginning a strange, weightless dance over his head like rotted marionettes. Emmers felt a tingle like warm static over his skin as he gazed up at the morbid puppets jerking at the end of the ropes. "How did you do that?" he said, smiling despite the horror he was witnessing. "I can show you how. I can show you so many things." The alarm clock sounded in loud, stabbing chirps within his ears, and Detective Diedrich Abendroth rolled onto his side and carefully pressed the dismiss button with stiff, sleepy movements. He lay his head back down onto the pillow and gazed up at the ceiling as he forced the memory of the nightmare he had been having from his still semi-unconscious mind. He rose from bed, groaning as his head pounded from the intense hangover which fell upon him in a dismal weight with each ongoing beat of his heart. He forced himself to stand, and then made his way, clothed only in white striped boxers, to the kitchen, where he found coffee already made in the automated coffee maker. Before filling the white mug which waited on the counter with deep, black, strong morning brew, he poured cool tap water into it and emptied it into his dry mouth. This ritual he repeated 3 times in an attempt to foil the dehydration which afflicted his alcohol-ravaged body. He paused for a moment and considered his sympathy for non-German alcoholics who might feel waves of guilt over a late-night binge like he had indulged the previous evening. However, here in Berlin, such a sight was not only common, but almost expected. Diedrich had read a report earlier that week which had declared that although Germans drink often, they do not drink to excess as much as other nationalities. This he found contrary to the large number of reported cases of alcohol poisoning, which he saw regularly crossing his desk at the station. Either way, Diedrich had been drinking since he was 16 years old, and now in his 40th year he was finally beginning to feel less like a social drinker, and more like a person definitely addicted to a substance. But it had only been over the past 4 years that he had noticed that during his brief periods of abstinence that intense withdrawal symptoms drove him quickly to a pint of lager much sooner than ever before. And in the past 2 years he had taken to carrying his hip flask of vodka with him at all times. As he gazed around the empty apartment, he wondered if he had someone else present in his life, if they would call him a drunk and force him to quit. He seldom dwelt on such thoughts, for long self-pity would only lead to another round of drinks sooner than later. He seated himself at his small kitchen table and turned on the morning news, which was currently discussing the breaking story that the American serial killer Jeffrey Dahmer had been clubbed to death 3 days ago by a fellow inmate. Diedrich listened carefully as they rehashed the details of his crimes, capture, and conviction. As an investigator for the LKA, specializing in serial homicides, Diedrich had reviewed Dahmer's profile carefully. Dahmer had definitely represented the high end of serial killer ritualistic involvements and was textbook in his methodology and execution. However, it was the apparent lack of any environmental influence of the killer's psychological development which had befuddled the profilers in the case. He had been a prime example of a killer born and not made, a fact which disturbed most normal-thinking individuals, as this would indicate that such evil could be inherent. Diedrich, however, believed in inherent evil. He felt he had seen it far too many times to question its existence. Later, standing in the bathroom as he let the shower water warm, he gazed at his reflection in the steaming mirror. The sharp, hawkish face, which he saw looked much more tired than it had only a few years before. The cold blue eyes, which he saw, were bloodshot and muddled with more than steam. He ran his hands through his slick, black, gray-streaked hair and wondered how much longer he could continue like this. He was getting older, and the job had become a psychological endurance marathon, which eventually he would have to forfeit at a loss. However, at the root of it all was Diedrich's fascination with the human condition. He was perplexed and in awe of the variation and resemblance each personality bore in difference and similarity to the other. He had seen the peaks and troughs of good and evil, with infinity of gray between, and into the gray he had faded like the blue winter sky, as it is covered in a blanket of all still even clouds. He was cold within, and no amount of alcohol could revive the life that had once stirred below in the frigid ice upon his soul. People in professions which require them to develop a strong ambivalence to the darker characteristics or pain of the human experience often tell themselves that the resulting numbness is a necessity, that this is a survival mechanism which develops to help them cope and continue with doing what needs to be done. This may well be true, but at the same time, recovery of those desperate fragments of compassion and empathy is not so easily accomplished. Diedrich had put a distance between himself and others so that he might observe them with a more detached lens. Unfortunately, now the distance could not be bridged, and he was floating adrift on the edge of contact. He watched as his reflection was enveloped and lost in the gray steam as it covered the glass. Soon, he could no longer even recognize himself within. He had just finished showering when he heard the phone ringing. Wrapping his legs in a towel, he dashed down the hall and answered the phone breathlessly. "Dieter," said a cheerful female voice on the other end of the line, belonging to the chief's assistant, Agnes Baum. Diedrich winced at the nickname, although he had heard it since childhood, when his mother had taken to calling him by it from the time he lay in swaddling clothes. "Yes, Kristen," he replied, as he put 2 slices of bread into the toaster and poured more coffee, droplets falling from his still-soaked hair to the countertop. "The chief wanted me to inform you that you need not to come to the station this morning." "Oh, good. Day off then," he chuckled, as he watched the football scores from the game last night. Although he had been watching the game at the beer hall, he could not recall the ending through the fog of intoxication. "You are so amusing, Dieter. But no, there may be a lead in the disappearances, and the chief wants to go to Charlottenburg to do an interview." Diedrich sighed and removed his notebook from the coat which hung on the back of his kitchen chair. He scribbled the name Katja Drescher and an address just off of campus at the Berlin University of the Arts. "Frau Drescher is the wife of Emmerich Drescher, who went missing last week. She says that she may have information concerning his whereabouts." Drescher was the poet, correct? "Yes, both of them were lecturers at the university." "I will be on my way momentarily." Diedrich hung up and removed his toast as it popped from the slots and laid it on a saucer as he went to his bedroom to dress. He was not surprised by his morning assignment, as interviews were Diedrich's specialty. Diedrich had made a career from reading reactions and masterful interrogations. People who trusted no one found themselves at ease in his presence, which only added to the paradox of his isolated personal existence. To him, it was no mystery that, although others were compelled to trust in and confide in him, he trusted no one and was suspect of every soul he crossed. A lifetime of revealing the secrets and deceptions of his fellow men had ensured this fact. To Diedrich, man was a complex, contrary, and oftentimes confused animal who acted accordingly. He did not deny the good that men could do, but seeing the potential for destruction in so many had left him without illusions. Most often, a person's turn for good or evil was made in the impulse of only a few brief firings of neurons, and in the span of seconds, an entire destiny was laid out. Diedrich found his Volkswagen parked across the street, although he could not clearly recall leaving it there, or the ride home for that matter. He was pleased to find that he had locked it, but his self-congratulation was cut short when he realized he had vomited in the passenger side floorboard. One of the more troubling aspects of the alcoholic mind is the ability of the individual to begin accepting missing time and memory lapses with no real concern. The alcoholic has a great and often misplaced faith in the alternate personality which is guiding their actions while under the influence. They often assume that there were reasons for their actions, even as they find themselves at a loss as to the actual rationale involved. It is only as the illness progresses and the alternate begins committing actions so far from what the sober self can accept that the alcoholic may begin to question the judgment of their inebriated co-pilot. This was the state of Diedrich's mind as he drove down the street with his windows down in the cold of winter to alleviate the foul stench of his own throw-up beside him. He told himself that tonight he would wait until he got home before he would drink, and after a few glasses he would go out and clean the sick from his vehicle. Over time, the alcoholic will choose to perform most unpleasant tasks only after they have sufficiently medicated themselves, a condition that will eventually become troublesome as life in general begins to seem but one long, unpleasant task. Diedrich pushed aside his concerns and concentrated on the task at hand. As he navigated the morning traffic and forced cautious awareness of wayward bicyclists on the road, he began to mentally review the case. In his mind, he outlaid a map of Berlin and began visualizing points on the grid where the disappearances had taken place. The missing persons ranged from the upper echelon of the social status all the way down to prostitutes and runaways. Try as he might, he could not devise any discernible connection between the individuals. He knew that there must be some relating factor, but he would need a lead to reveal the hidden web which had ensnared all of them. If it had been just higher class individuals, then he would investigate it as possible political crime, and if it had been only the night people of the Berlin underworld, it might suggest a serial killer. However, there were still no bodies and no real evidence that the number of incidents having risen as of 2 days ago to 14. At first, investigators had not even linked the first 6 as being related. Streetwalkers and drug addicts went missing every day and often went unreported. These unfortunate individuals probably would have finished without report if it had not been for the growing paranoia within the subculture itself. Police were forced to take notice when prostitutes themselves demanded their attention, but still the reports had been largely disregarded. It was only when 3 wealthy business owners and 2 state employees were added to the list that the situation had gotten heated as the press got involved. By the time Professor Emmerich Drescher was reported missing by his wife and college faculty, the media had erupted into a full-blown circus. Diedrich was leaving from Miet through the Brandenburg Gate on his way to Charlottenburg, which lay on the southern side of the Spree River. Charlottenburg, Wilmersdorf borough was considered the cultural center of the city and had been the hub of West Berlin during the reunification in 1990. Diedrich was somewhat pleased to be entering what he thought of as the most beautiful section of the city in the clear, cold morning. He checked the address again and made his way towards the college before exiting into a small residential area which housed many of the school's teaching staff. As he drove slowly through the pleasant neighborhood, he noticed the sky darkening in the distance over the houses and wondered if yet another snowstorm was imminent. He spied this small cottage-like brick home that waited at the top of a long paved drive and began approaching with studious caution. The yard was large and ringed with oak trees that huddled still laden in snow during the empty yard space. A light blanket of white still clung to the row of hedges which ran between the home's windows as well. He parked and reluctantly rolled up the windows with disgust and a trace of self-loathing. He was far from the attitudes of a younger man who might have laughed at his night's debauchery and cursed himself a fool, yet he had still filled his flask before leaving and tucked it into his coat while his toast remained forgotten and uneaten on the counter. Closing the car door behind him, he made his way to the front step and stomped the ice from his boots on the welcome mat before ringing the bell. As he waited, his sour stomach growled with a mixture of hunger and nausea. His throat felt raw and somewhat swollen, and he coughed into his hands so that his voice might sound less gravelly and low. He gazed over the yard. He momentarily felt the pangs of longing for the quiet, secluded nature of the area. In his idle moments, he often dreamed of a comfortable family life in a nice suburb, but alas, such an idyllic existence had eluded him, or it. In the silent moment of contemplation, he was completely unprepared for the sight which greeted him as the front door unlatched and opened. There, standing before him, dressed in a large woolen brown sweater and green skirt, was the most naturally beautiful woman Diedrich had ever laid eyes on. She was young, probably not clear of her mid-30s, and she gazed at him with the most intense and penetrating brown eyes he had ever seen. Her hair was golden blonde and pinned up in a style which did not seem altogether modern, and her small, pale lips made no expression as she spoke. Are you from the police? There was no hint of emotion on her round, pale face as her eyes bore into him like search beacons, cutting into his soul with an invasiveness he found disquieting. Yes, he asked, masking his unease. I am Detective Abendroth. May I see your identification? She asked with cold, plain courtesy. Why, of course, he said as he withdrew his wallet to display his badge and ID. She took it in her small hand and examined it carefully before returning it to him. Come in, please, it is very cold. She held the door as he entered and closed it behind him. The interior of the house was everything one might expect of a professor's home. It was somewhat spacious, but warm and cluttered with antiques, tables, and bookshelves. The living room into which he was led was furnished in large, soft chairs and a couch covered in knitted blankets beside a small brick fireplace which crackled with wood that smelled of cedar. She gestured for him to sit on the sofa, as she herself sat in the large chair to his left. She pulled a napkin over her lap, and he saw a woman dressed in an apron enter from what he guessed was the kitchen. Katja Drescher told the housekeeper to bring coffee, and she quietly retreated again, only to return with a tray on which sat a metal coffee pot and 2 cups. She filled the cups, and with a nod from her employer, left once more. Alexia is a wonderful girl. I don't know what I would do without her. Katja said casually as she cradled the cup in her hands, as if savoring the warmth. I'm very grateful you could come so early, Detective. If I had waited long, I might have lost my nerve. Why is that, Frau Drescher? Friedrich was sipping coffee and studying the woman for any hint of what her emotional state might be, but found her an unreadable wall of calm beauty. You have already spoken to the police. Was something occurred since then? I must admit that when I first spoke to the investigators, I was thinking it might be possible that Emmerich might return, and so was conservative in what information I offered. And now your feelings have changed? As I have learned the details of the other disappearances, I fear that Emmerich may well have been involved in something. Dietrich's eyes fell upon his table, pushed against the far wall, which was covered in an assortment of framed pictures. Quickly his mind began to assess details of the pictures, and was reminded that Emmerich Drescher was a man of advanced years. In fact, the most recent photos of him with his young wife indicated he may well have crested 70 years of age. The face, which he saw staring out with the barest hint of smile, was one of calculating and intense intelligence despite the lines of age and thin white hair. My pardon, but the professor was a very well-reputed individual. What do you think he could have done to put himself in danger? What you mean to say, she said, sipping the steaming coffee without even a breath to cool it, is that he was a very old man. You are of course correct, but you must understand that Emmerich was brilliant, and such genius often belies a much sordid intellect. Her dark eyes met his, and he was momentarily frozen with the notion that she was reading his thoughts. He had many varied interests, which often led him to associate with people that were sometimes morally questionable. Dietrich forced himself to remain collected and unresponsive to the strange, probing nature of the woman's gaze. You will have to elaborate more fully, he said, as he placed the coffee back onto the tray and removed his notebook and pen. I wish that I could, but much of his personal affairs he kept very private. I can only say that our relationship is one of mutual interests and not intimate trust. I am his companion, and I help him in his work when there is need, but I am not privy to all the details of his personal life. However, there was a man whom he had contact with over this past year who I believe may in some way be related to Emmerich's disappearance. His name is Gregor Fiedler, and I have found a number in Emmerich's contacts which I believe is his. Dietrich stopped writing as he heard the name. Gregor Fiedler. Are you sure? Yes. Are you familiar with the man? Frau Drescher, I do not wish to alarm you, but Fiedler is the proprietor of a club here in Berlin. A club which caters to those with peculiar sexual eccentricities. Dietrich watched to see if this inspired any reaction in the young woman, but her face remained a cold, impassive mask. Yes, I thought as much, Frau Drescher. Was your husband a homosexual? She looked at him without shock or insult before replying. If only, he was just homosexual Detective Abendroth, but I fear that nothing as mundane as simple sexual congress with another man would entertain him. Diedrich left the Drescher house, his mind turning with curious energy. The rank smell in his car was forgotten as he quickly began to assimilate the new information which had been presented to him. The Drescher woman had shaken him with her strange demeanor, and he had found his hand drifting to the inside of his coat towards the cold flask which waited. But he soon resolved to fight the urge as he drove to police headquarters. He did not like the way that Katja had spoken of her husband with such calm and distant dismissal. He had the distinct feeling that she knew much more than what she had revealed, and was simply baiting him with bits of knowledge in an attempt to guide him along some ubiquitous path. Diedrich was very familiar with the sensation of being manipulated by such deceptive personalities, and the woman's beauty was a perfect disguise for motives which could easily be malignant and dark. At the station, he went straight to his desk and began searching information on the people now in question. First, he pulled up files on Emmerich and Katja Drescher and spent the rest of the morning researching their past with strange and confusing results. Emmerich Drescher had spent much of his formative years after college traveling the world and working various jobs as editor for literary digests and teaching positions in several prestigious colleges all over Europe. By the 50s, he had already published 3 well-received books of poetry and had toured the poetry circus extensively before his first wife, also a poet, the somewhat famous Petrus Strauss. Petrus Strauss was born in Germany, but her family had moved to England when she was still a child. She was a well-educated, if somewhat troubled young woman who had met Drescher as one of his students while he was teaching in London. It seemed that even then the already 40-year-old Emmerich had a preference for younger women. They married in 1961 and soon thereafter had 2 children together. The state of their union was one of great speculation by peers, and it was reported that the older man treated his young bride abysmally, and was reputed to be regularly seen in the company of other young women and men who were commonly his students as well. In 1964, Petra ended their marriage and finished the second of what would be her only 2 volumes of collected poetry. In January of 1965, the young poetess committed suicide in her flat in London. Drescher was blamed by Petra's fans and colleagues for having driven the already emotionally unstable woman to her end. He left the 2 children with Petra's sister to return to his birthplace in Berlin, and 5 years later he took the position which he had held up until recent time. In 1989, the aging professor announced his engagement to his young secretary, a girl named Katja Reiniger, whom he apparently was instrumental in funding and starting her own career as a journalist and poet. Diedrich stared at the monitor and scratched at the stubble of his chin, and he wondered the meaning of what he had learned. Here was a brilliant but heartless man who had taken every advantage of his position throughout his life in order to use and betray those around him. It seemed likely that any number of jilted lovers or enemies may have wanted him dead, but still, there were the other disappearances, and Drescher's link to Gregor Fiedler. He searched Fiedler's file and marveled at the list of convictions which began appearing beneath his name. Fiedler was a pornographer and sex addict who had been arrested on numerous occasions for various crimes which ranged from possession of narcotics to public exposure and solicitation. His nightclub, Dem Witterkopf, was a fetishist swingers bar which was at the top of the city's list of places the police would most like to terminate, but by carefully treading the line of legality, Fiedler had managed to keep his establishment open. The club was originally an abandoned library in the Schönberg district and was now infamous for its tent-room attraction. Besides dancing and techno music, the club offered 10 separate chambers which devoted to a particular sexual proclivity. Dietrich noted that the club was the only known listed address for Fiedler, and he had the feeling that he was going to have to pay a visit there whether he liked it or not. Dietrich was not particularly troubled by the various sexual preferences of the human spectrum. He found it somewhat sad that people's minds fixated so much on activities which he found meaningless, time-consuming, and futile. Even though sexuality was but another expression of each person's own complexly shaped ego, it seemed tragic that so much focus was given to actions which were so afflicted by intrusions of development in early childhood. People spent lifetimes in pursuit of power plays, role assignment, and the exaltation of object sensuality. Dietrich's own history of sexual experience was but a brief footnote in a life spent in the pursuit of understanding mankind's psychological functioning. He had 3 recordable relationships with intelligent and respectable women who he had in time driven away with his obsession with his career, and less admittedly, alcohol. Any one of the 3 would have made acceptable and loving companions, but his cool temperament and lack of emotional expression had left these connections severed and lifeless within a few years. He had made himself an observer, and was therefore apparently incapable of involvement in what he had come to observe was normal life. Dietrich turned in his chair and observed that it was well past lunchtime. He gave a glance at the map of Berlin, which was posted on his office wall, and once more reviewed the last locations where the victims had been seen. His study was abruptly interrupted by a knock on the door of his office as an officer named Klaus entered. "Excuse me, sir," he said, standing in the doorway. "The chief wants you to come down to the interrogation room." "Why?" Dietrich said wearily as he rubbed his eyes and thought of the bottle of scotch which waited him at home. "One of the missing persons from your case has shown up." "Which one?" he asked, snapping into sharp and awakened interest as he stood and grabbed his coat. "A young woman named Haida Dur. She was identified trying to board a train out of Berlin to Amsterdam." Without another word, Dietrich flew from the office and dashed to the elevator downstairs. Dur was a young female escort, an erotic dancer, in another of Berlin's nightclubs. She had been one of the first disappearances reported by her roommate, who had become concerned when her friend had not shown up for either of her jobs or at their apartment for a week. The woman who sat at the wooden table of the interrogation room held little in resemblance to the photographs which Dietrich had studied in her file. She was dressed in an inexpensive business suit and had cut her red hair into shorter, more mature style. She wore glittering diamond earrings and a shining pendant on a gold chain which also appeared to be inlaid with a precious stone. Dietrich turned to Chief Braun, who stood beside him studying the woman through the two-way mirror. "It seems that Frau Dur has gone to some lengths to change her appearance," Dietrich commented as he closed the folder he held in his hand. "Yes, and by the looks of things she has come into some money during her disappearance," the chief commented as he stroked his long gray goatee. "How did you get her to come in? She hasn't committed any crimes," Dietrich said as he walked towards the door. "We simply told her that she was wanted in questioning in relation to the other disappearances. She seemed irritated, but agreed to help if she could." "And she did not seem as if she were hiding anything?" "No, she only complained that she was going to have to reschedule her trip. You know, it is possible that none of these disappearances are even related. I would agree with you if it weren't for my talk today with Katja Drescher." "Why is that?" "It seems that our missing professor was involved with some rather unseemly people in Schönberg." "Great, and the press will have a field day if they know that. I might have to make a visit to Dem Witterkopf tonight." "For God's sake, be discreet, Dieter. We have to keep this all hushed up as possible until we can get a better handle on what's really going on." "I will do everything in my power." Dietrich left the room and walked a few steps down the hall before entering the room where Haida Dur waited patiently with her hands folded on the table before her. "I am sorry to keep you waiting, Frau Dur," he said as he seated himself in the chair across from her and began once more studying the file. She smiled slightly, and Dietrich noted that even her expression seemed different than any he had perceived in the many photos supplied by her roommate. "That's quite all right," she said wistfully. "Anything I can do to help the police. I must confess that I was not even aware that I was the subject of any ongoing investigation." Her manner was calm and professional, and her way of speaking proper and educated. all in contrast to the history in her file, which indicated she was from a lower-class, undereducated background, raised by an abusive drug addict in the inner city. First, I must inquire where you have been for the past month. Your roommate and employer are somewhat concerned. I've been here in Berlin, living at a hotel. And you didn't care to contact your friends? I'm sorry, but I didn't catch your name. Her voice had a sharp and icy tone as she gazed at Diedrich with hard, unblinking blue eyes. I'm very sorry, I have completely forgotten my manners. You may call me Detective Abendroth. Oh, yes, I have heard of you. Your name is in the paper on occasion. Unfortunately, yes, I have had a few cases make the news. Pardon, Detective Abendroth, but isn't your specialty homicide? You are very correct, but since many of these disappearances may well be homicides, I was called in on the case. Well, I can assure you that I am not dead, she laughed quietly. Recently, I made the acquaintance of a man who I intend to marry. He insisted that I move into more appropriate lodgings as he prepared for me to move in with him in Holland. Can you give me his name? Of course, his name is Alexander Berghaus. Diedrich looked up in surprise. The architect. Indeed, he is very famous. I was very fortunate to meet him. He has truly changed my life. I am sorry, Detective Abendroth, but I really can be of no help to you. I hope that you can find your missing persons. Do you require anything else of me? No. I wish you well. And congratulations on your nuptials. Then I may go? Yes, do you need any help finding your way out? No, I quite remember the way in. She bowed her head slightly as she gathered her coat, and Diedrich led her to the door. Outside in the hallway, the chief met him as they watched her walk out past the front desk. Well, that was pointless, the chief growled with irritation. Maybe not as much as you think, Diedrich said thoughtfully as he once more gazed at the picture of the wild, vivacious girl portrayed in the photo in his hand. What do you mean? I find it remarkable that Frau Duhr has had such a stunning transformation in not only her appearance, but her demeanor. That woman was intelligent, articulate, and well-spoken. From what I gathered from my questioning of her roommate, she is supposedly a somewhat blunt and aggressively speaking young woman. When she was arrested 2 years ago for public intoxication, she punched, kicked, and spit in the face of the arresting officer. People do change, I guess, the chief said as he studied the picture of the scantily clad vixen with wonder. Yes, they do. But I am very curious as to how she managed to change so abruptly. She didn't really seem to be hiding anything. No, not overtly, but that woman was no novice at evasion. I would stake my life on it. Go and talk to Fiedler. See what you can dig up. Diedrich nodded his consent as the chief made his way back to his office. Diedrich bit his lip with frustration as he replayed the conversation with Duhr. What was it about that woman that seemed so peculiar? There was something so distinctly familiar about her mannerisms and speech, as if she were using a dialect he had heard once long ago, but had by now forgotten. Diedrich shook off the nagging thought and resolved himself to store his doubts until more information was revealed. He was starving now, and the sickness of last night's drinking was giving way to a cold, ravenous sobriety. He checked his watch, and finding it well past lunch, decided on heading to a restaurant for some currywurst and beer before heading to Schönberg. He winced when he thought of his car, but resolved himself to continue with his denial. However, the ideal was not as strong as his physical revulsion, and he found himself driving home to clean the mess. An hour or so later, he found himself hunkered down, scrubbing the floor of his car with a bag of old rags and a bucket of soapy water. After he had finished, he sighed with satisfaction and, taking the bag and bucket, was heading back to his apartment when he saw a man standing on the sidewalk a few paces away, staring at him from behind dark sunglasses. The man was a young German who looked like the type who would frequent raves and underground clubs. He had blonde hair, which was slicked back over his head to reveal a face pallid and thin. He was dressed all in black, with his hands shoved into the pockets of a leather trench coat. "Can I do something for you?" Diedrich asked as he lifted the bucket and slung the garbage bag over his shoulder. "Are you Detective Abendroth?" the man said without moving. "Who wishes to know?" Diedrich paused and was suddenly frozen, with a deep foreboding which sent his nerves immediately on edge. The man did not reply, but instead withdrew his right gloved hand from within the pocket of the coat, with a small caliber handgun gripped tightly in his fingers. Diedrich quickly jumped onto the hood of his car and rolled over to the street as the stranger unleashed a volley of shots, which shattered the car windows. Diedrich quickly reached to his shoulder holster and, pulling his Walther PPK, aimed and fired at his assailant. The stranger fell back as 3 bullets found their mark directly in his chest. Diedrich watched in astonishment as the man awkwardly fired 2 more shots as he ran into traffic and disappeared. Diedrich began to pursue, but ran only a block before his would-be assassin was lost amongst cars and pedestrians. Returning to his car, he got on the police radio and called in the attack. He sat dumbfounded and shivering behind the wheel of the Volkswagen as he contemplated what had just happened. He assumed that the attacker had been wearing a bulletproof vest, but he could clearly recall seeing blood on the man's chest and spattered on the sidewalk behind him. Standing from the car, his recollection was confirmed, as there was indeed a crimson spray on the concrete. He had shot the man dead center in the chest 3 times, and he had run away as if nothing had happened. As he walked back to his car, he heard the voice of the chief over the speaker of the police radio. "Dieter! Dieter! Are you there?" "Yes," he replied as he took the receiver in his shaking hand. "Are you going to have to come into the station?" The chief's voice was anxious and demanding. "I will fill out a statement later. I need to speak with Fiedler." "No, Dieter. We found something in the freezer of an abandoned restaurant uptown. The landlord noticed yesterday that a generator was running, and when we checked, the cooler was on. He opened it and found 7 bodies, Dieter. It's too soon to say for sure, but we think we have the 7 of our missing persons. One of them is most certainly Emmerich Drescher." "I'll be there momentarily." Diedrich leaned back and gazed at the street as cars drove by, and citizens stood watching, still fascinated by the events which had transpired only a few minutes before. 3 squad cars passed with sirens blaring in pursuit of the shooter, which Diedrich had a most certain feeling they would not apprehend. He thought of his flask, and then of the bottle in his apartment. He had missed lunch, and the beer he had so desperately been longing for. He felt weak and almost feverish as the excitement of almost being killed began to transgress into an almost aching need for a drink. But he knew what he needed to remain sharp and focused. Tonight, he would treat himself to the entire bottle, with some Handel in his apartment. But then again, whoever had tried to kill him knew where he lived. He would need men patrolling his street now. He sighed and placed his keys in the ignition. This had already been a long day. Diedrich stood in the forensic pathology lab at the police station with a coffee in one hand as he nibbled a Salzenstegen from the other. He gazed at the sheet-covered bodies as the examiner led him to the 3rd slab and removed the white covering to reveal the naked body of Emmerich Drescher. "What was the cause of death?" he asked the middle-aged woman named Agnes Mauer. "It is very early on to tell, but I am going to guess suicide," she said as she studied the lined mouth of the bluish cadaver with a latex-gloved hand. "All 7 of them?" he asked as he tried to imagine the beautiful young Katja with the aged and worn person who lay dead before him. There were traces of cyanide in all the blood work, and from the way they were positioned in the cooler, I would say they all went willingly and killed themselves within. For what purpose, though? Diedrich asked as he slipped the cover back from the body to his left and studied the visage of elderly Phyllis Wolfe, who had been missing for a month. Each of them is well over 60 years of age. Perhaps it is some kind of euthanasia death pact, the coroner suggested as she turned Emmerich's head to the side and inspected the nape of the corpse's neck. Were they terminally ill? Dietrich walked to the desk and began pulling up files on the morgue computer. No, not from what I can find in any of their hospital records, but some people do not enjoy the concept of old age. They may have been old, Doctor, but these people were fit and active, particularly Professor Drescher. He was still enjoying quite a few aspects of the earthly realm, from what I understand. Yes, he did have quite a reputation. Agnes was now shining a penlight into the cadaver's eye as she held his eyelid open. So, you've heard of his infidelities? Dietrich remarked with curiosity as he looked up from Drescher's medical history. If you want to call it that, yes, she replied. She straightened and walked over to pour herself coffee from the warm pot on the counter. What do you mean? Well, is it really cheating with these open relationships they have nowadays? Are you saying that Frau Drescher had extramarital affairs of her own? You could call them affairs, but from what I understand, the professor here was part of her experiments? You are saying that she had relations with other women. Women and men, and both at the same time. The gossip is really quite racy about them. Dr. Mauer, how do you know all this? My younger sister, mostly. She goes to the art school. She studies piano and composition. She says that the Dreschers are a really hot item on the club scene. I met Frau Drescher earlier when she came in to identify her husband. She really wasn't what I expected. Agnes pushed a gray strand of brown hair back from her forehead as she gazed at Dietrich with hidden delight at his interest in the raunchy gossip. How so? He asked, trying to hide his shock at the revelation. She does seem so reserved. I was expecting some kind of wanton sex fiend from all the stories. It seems hard to imagine such a quiet woman involved in sex, drugs, and orgies. Yes, indeed, he said as he stood and began to walk to the door. You will notify me if you find anything. Of course, detective. And by the way, Dieter. Yes, Agnes. How long has it been since you had a home-cooked meal? Ages, he answered with a smile. Why don't you let me cook for you some night? He looked down wistfully for a moment before answering. When this case is over, I have a free night. I would love to. Good. I will call you on that. Dietrich walked down the fluorescent-lit hallway, paging through the volumes of collected bits of stored information in his mind. There was something that he was missing, some detail that his conscious was overlooking, but that his unconscious was screaming at him to notice. He rode the lift upstairs and headed for his office, where he once more stared at the map of the city. Reaching into the upper drawer of his desk, he pulled out a handful of files, which he spread over the top and scanned with keen, searching eyes. He had found one group of his vanished persons, but there was still another 7. He separated the stack, and taking the files which contained information on the lower city group, he opened them and removed the most recent photo of each from its folder. Taking tacks, he attached the pictures to the adjoining locations where they had last been seen. He leaned back on his desk and stared at the board as he tried to allow his mind to untangle itself from the twisted mess of thoughts and emotion. His eyes traveled over the pictures, and soon his mind had quieted as he allowed the turning wheels of his intellect to slowly begin rolling unhindered. He studied the street names and landmarks without concentrating too intently on any one detail, while simultaneously allowing the images on the photographs to hover in the peripheral of his vision. The sick, feverish feeling had returned, but it served only to dim his senses and allow a faint haze to cloud over his senses. It was just then that his eyes, as if by their own accord, settled on one particular photograph. The picture was of a young man named Oswald Fruoff, who was an 18-year-old petty criminal. He had been arrested the previous year on burglary charges. The picture was a mugshot depicting a disheveled teenage boy with stringy blonde hair hanging over high cheekbones and a dejected face adorned in a faint adolescent beard. Dietrich stared at the picture and let the features of the boy sink into his mind as he created a mental 3D image of the face. He began to recall the physical details Oswald's description from the file, which were particularly detailed, as he was one of the few missing whose parents had actually been the ones to file the report. 18 years of age, blonde hair, hazel eyes, medium build, about 5'11", weighing in the neighborhood of 80 kilos. Dietrich began to see the boy, and as the epiphany burst in his brain, he stood forward and pinned the picture with his index finger. "It was you," he said out loud, as he poked the photo repeatedly. He could see the face from the photo now, with the hair carefully slicked back and eyes hidden behind dark sunglasses. "You tried to kill me, Oswald," he said with a mixture of wonder and rage. But how had the boy taken those 3 bullets? Dietrich pulled back from the board and ran his trembling hand through his hair with anxious excitement at his realization. He quickly turned to the phone and buzzed the chief's office. What? What is it, Dieter?" the chief said with his usual carefully masked irritation. "Oswald Fruhoff was the gunman," Dietrich said through a tightly clenched jaw as he repressed his urge to rant emotionally. "The boy who went missing from the pub 2 weeks ago." "The same. We can tell the patrols to look for him, but they have already been for 14 days. The chief chuckled with the irony, but the humor escaped Dietrich. "I'm sorry, Dietrich," the chief said apologetically. "I'll be sure to get the word out." Dietrich nodded to the phone as the chief could see through the receiver as he hung up. Dietrich collapsed in his office chair and stared at his screensaver of an elk he had shot hunting the previous year. Once more he struggled to clear his thoughts. Should he go now to see Fiedler, or should he follow the gnawing urge in his stomach to go back to the Drescher house and see what more information he could gather from Katja? Then a voice spoke in his mind, unbidden, saying with indiscriminate sarcasm, "Maybe you just want to see her again. So young, pretty, and liberal with her sexual morals." Dietrich swallowed the dry lump in his throat as he leaned back and looked at the ceiling. "God, I just want a drink," he thought. He was sweating profusely again, but his flesh was cold and seemed to be crawling with discomfort. He imagined taking out the flask and emptying its bitter, burning contents into his dry, waiting mouth. However, he also envisioned strolling into Fiedler's sex club half intoxicated, or questioning the young Drescher woman with the taint of vodka on his breath, and saw a series of incidents unfolding which would in no way be beneficial to himself or the case. He had to remain sober, at least until he was alone tonight in his apartment, where only God would see the drunken mess he would become. It was nearly 8 o'clock in the evening when he made it to Club Dem Witterkopf. The street outside the old library was filled with groups of punks and black-clad Gothic-style persons talking and waiting in a chaotic line from the stone steps of the entrance. He pushed his way to the front, repressing the urge to flash his badge, and confronted the doorman. The massive bodybuilder gazed at Dietrich with instant recognition, as this was not Dietrich's first time visiting the establishment. He leaned in and whispered in the man's ear, "Just a few questions for Herr Fiedler, Rolf. No trouble tonight." Rolf nodded and pulled the rope aside to allow Dietrich's passage. "He was at the bar the last time I saw him," Rolf growled from beneath a trim brown beard. Dietrich's nerves were already on edge, and the 3 codeine and acetaminophen he had taken were just barely managing to take the edge off of his raw state of being. He looked through the throngs of dancing patrons, through a fog of flashing strobes and smoke to the bar which stood where the librarian's desk would have been. Everywhere he looked, he saw flashes of exposed naked skin and writhing pale bodies, but the overpowering smell of beer and spirits seemed much more distracting. As he waded through the sea of bodies, each seeming to radiate a solid heat and scent of sweat and cologne, eyes fell upon him with amused smiles and nervous nods. Everywhere, couples and groups seemed engaged in some kind of lurid activity. Men kissed and flirted with other men, women fondled each other seductively, and every combination in between could be witnessed in the crowd. Finally, he saw his target leaned casually against the bar, sipping some strange blue cocktail from a brandy sifter. Gregor Fiedler was a tall, lean, ferret-like individual with a green and purple dyed mohawk and an assortment of bodily piercings and tattoos. He saw Diedrich and shook his head with disappointment as he studied the detective through small, round spectacles with blue lenses. Diedrich sat down on a stool beside him and stared at the wall of bottles which stood in the dozens on a mirrored wall behind the bar with longing. "Don't give me that look, Gregor. I don't want to be here any more than you want me here. Would you like a drink, Detective Abendroth?" Kierkegaard said, his smooth, effeminate tone. "You know better," Diedrich said in the most relaxed voice he could muster. "Oh, and I thought this might be a social call," Gregor chuckled as he leaned his elbows back against the bar. No games tonight, Gregor. I am not in the mood." "How can I be of service to the LKA then?" "Tell me what you know about Emmerich Drescher," Diedrich said, now watching Gregor's very expression with concentrated watchfulness. "He was a poet. More personal, he was a dirty old man." "How dirty?" "About as dirty as they come. You might fancy a shower after saying good morning to him." Diedrich resisted the urge to laugh. "And how exactly did you come to know this dirty old man?" "He was a client." "In what regard?" "He and a few of his senile crew like to rent room 11. "I thought there were only 10 rooms." Gregor looked at Diedrich over the top of his glasses and smiled. "Room 11 is for special parties." "It used to be the storage basement, but a few years ago I had it renovated for use by a high-paying clientele." "What kind of activities is room 11 customarily used for?" "Any kind of activity the client desires." "What about murder?" Gregor's facade of casual ease quickly disintegrated into naked, anxious fear. "I do not run that kind of show, Detective Abendroth. What is this all about, anyway?" "It's about 7 dead citizens, all found in some kind of apparent suicide in an abandoned restaurant cooler. I believe that they may be the crew of dirty old people of whom you so warmly spoke." Gregor was stricken with shock. "I had nothing to do with that mess, Abendroth," he whispered urgently. "Whatever weird shit those old fucks were into had nothing to do with me. Room 11 is for private parties. I don't have the faintest clue what their swing was. They rented a room, they brought their guests, and they left through the back when they were done." "Who were their guests?" "Kids off the street, dancers, whores, whatever pretty face they managed to coax back there. Money talks, and they had the cash to buy whatever they wanted." "Did you know any of those guests personally?" Just Alwyn Zweig. He was a boy whore who came in here a few times a week." "Did you know that Alwyn Zweig went missing a few weeks ago?" "How can you even tell? Zweig was like a street rat, always crawling out of a dumpster or crack in the wall. That street rat had a grandmother that he visited at her retirement home 3 times a week to play checkers ever since he was 12. When he missed 4 visits and couldn't be reached by the staff nurse, his grandmother insisted on calling the police." Gregor stared down at the floor with an expression that Diedrich found difficult to read. "I didn't know," Gregor said with uncharacteristic shame. "I liked him. I hope he is okay." "Yes, do I. And that is why, if there's anything you know that might help me locate him, that would be most appreciated." Gregor looked at Diedrich as if wrestling with some inner turmoil. "You're going to think this is crazy, but I'm just going to say it. Speak freely, Herr Fiedler. I think the old Lunds were into the occult. Dietrich's eyes widened with surprise. You mean as in magic? Yes, as in black magic. I've been around, detective, and there are people in this city who are into some really strange shit. There are people who come here who are into scarification, bloodletting, vampirism, and worse. I know people, detective, who think that they can talk to the dead and summon demons to get job promotions. I'm not saying that I believe in it, but there are people around who most definitely do. Drescher and his crew showed all the hallmarks of being heavily into some dark magic bullshit. And what about Herr Drescher's wife? Was she ever present at any of these private parties? Yeah, the young pretty thing. She was here a couple of times last month, but I haven't seen her since. Dietrich looked back at the wall of bottles and grew silent. That's it, Abendroth. That's all I know. Thank you, Gregor. You've been most helpful.